Hello, everyone. How are you? We're kicking off the DigiLabour Book Talks for 2026. I'm Rafael Grohmann, Assistant Professor of Media Studies at the University of Toronto. And today we have here Andrea Pollio for the first book talk of the year. Andrea Pollio is Assistant Professor of Political and Economic Geography at the Department of Urban and Regional Studies of the Polytechnic of Turin in Italy and Research Associate at the African Center for Cities, University of Cape Town, South Africa. And today he will be presenting the book Silicon Elsewhere, Nairobi, Global China, and the Promise of Techno-Capital, published by University of California Press. And after the talk, we'll have a little bit of discussion with Julie, Yujie, Chen, which I really appreciate both your time and availability. And I will offer some discussions as well. Hello, Andrea. Hello, Julie. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me.
Hello, Julie.
I'm here.
Great. Andrea, thank you for the book. Congrats. For me, it's really a pleasure to, for those who don't know, three of us, plus Sherry Soriano, plus Niels van Doorn, are editors of the journal Platforms in Society. And it's really good to read your book. It's a beautiful reading book, and it's so special, important topic. And yeah, the floor is yours.
Cool. Thank you, Rafael. Thank you, Julie. I'm gonna share my screen. Okay, if you say, just say yes, because I can't see you anymore. Can you see my screen?
Yeah, we can see the screen.
Coming through. Okay, it is, of course, a fantastic pleasure to be here, and I'm particularly happy to be with my partners in crime, Julie and Rafael, in this conversation. I'm kind of new to the book talk business, so I truly appreciate your willingness to kind of be my guinea pigs in a way. I've done one book talk before. This is my second one, but still. So what I want to do, and I won't keep you too long because I think that online conversations can be tiring if only one person speaks for a long time. I want to give you a quick overview of the book, and then since also the work that I do with Rafael and Julie in thinking about platforms, I want to focus on one of the stories that I tell in the book, and that's specifically about platform economies. So if you look at the title of my book, Silicon Elsewhere, Nairobi, Global China, and the Promise of Techno-Capital, it does capture the three substantial themes, I guess, of this monograph, which are fundamentally Nairobi in Kenya, which is also known among tech folks and as the Silicon Savannah of Africa. Techno-Capital, of course, and the shifting presence of digital China, global China in the African continent. And so the overall project that I had in mind when I started working on this was fundamentally asking, can Nairobi be the vantage point to read the technopolitical shifts that are happening in our multipolar digital world, or in a world where there is not just one Silicon Valley, but many Silicon Elsewheres? And what does an African city, what does an African capital like Nairobi tell us about these meanings of and forms of techno-capital? So to do that, maybe kind of begins with two stories. The first story is something that journalists call the Look East shift of Kenya, or the Look East transition. This was a kind of like a policy moment in Kenya's recent past. From the early 2000s, basically, during this time, many Nairobians, many people in Nairobi remember their first contact with the global expansion of China. And this encounter in particular actually took place in a specific area of Nairobi, which is the middle class section of the city. It's called Kilimani. It's kind of leafy, and it was reserved for British settlers during colonial time. Today, it's kind of like one of the wealthier, in a way, areas of Nairobi. And around the 2000s, right, all of a sudden, small Chinese malls and shopping centers started appearing in this area. They would sell everything from cheap electronics to synthetic wigs to clothes, groceries, catering to locals, but also to an increasing population of Chinese workers who had come to Nairobi, who had relocated to Kenya on the back of state-owned companies. And these workers fundamentally were the human footprint of the infrastructure projects that had been envisioned by Kenya in the new democratic era of the nation, and that were being funded and also built by the overseas units of Chinese, large Chinese construction companies and engineering firms. So much so that in 10 years, China became Kenya's main business partners, also the main holder of Kenya's bilateral foreign debt, because of course many of these infrastructure projects were funded by agencies of the State Council in Beijing. And so this was the look east, right? It was all of a sudden the presence of China as a player in the economy of Kenya. It was, of course, a function of China's own policies, like the going out, the going global, and then later the Belt and Road Initiative. But it was also a project of the Kenyan state to actually deliver large-scale infrastructure like highways or entire new cities or railways and on and on. So this is one of the story. And Kilimani, in this area of Nairobi that I began the book with, started changing as well. So you had these small Chinese malls, but then all of a sudden you had the diplomatic mission of the Chamber of Commerce. You had media companies like China Daily, Xinhua, CGTN, Star Times. You had, the headquarters and the compounds of these large construction companies. Not to mention the hotels, the KTVs, the restaurants, and on and on. So in a way, Kilimani became known also kind of as the Chinatown of Nairobi. And I like the words of this journalist that I talked to, who said, you could see the sea change. Cities are very strange in this way. Change starts very small, a Chinese mall on a corner, and then the whole country enters a new era. And like elsewhere in Africa, I think the mid-2000s really kind of signaled this shift, right? With the arrival of Chinese capital and these kind of like geopolitical rearrangements in a continent that was shifting east. So this is one of the stories that I opened the book with. The second story happens in parallel, right? Happens at the same time. And this is the Silicon Savannah tale. I mentioned that Kenya is known as the Silicon Savannah because in the first decade of the new millennium was not just about this infrastructural friendship with China, but it was also a period of fast technological change for Kenya. And probably the tip of the iceberg was the invention of mobile money in Kenya, M-Pesa, which started as a small experiment, also copying kind of like the fact that people were already using scratch cards, airtime to fundamentally move money. And M-Pesa became like kind of this massive innovation in creating the possibility for people to have bank accounts in the context where most didn't have access to legacy banking, and fundamentally move money, virtual currency, from one SIM to another, cash in, cash out, using money kiosks. And in fact, M-Pesa, mobile money from Kenya, expanded to the rest of the African continent. It even expanded beyond Africa itself. So there were experiments with mobile money in many of the kind of post-socialist countries in Europe, like Albania and others. And from mobile money, right? Mobile money created this kind of like digital financial infrastructure from which a much bigger number of experiments kind of blossomed in all aspects of the digital economy, from paying taxes to street vending and on and on. There was also, the government put its weight behind this, so there were investment in undersea cables that kind of decreased the cost of connectivity, especially for since we are interested about in labor, for kind of like a fledgling small ecosystem of BPOs, of business process offshoring companies, that today have turned into the kind of like data training farms that were also quite notorious a few years back when there was that Time magazine report that exposed how ChatGPT and Meta had used Kenyan data workers to train their AI models and actually to flag violent content. So then there was the story of some of the best-known incubators in Africa. We're located in Nairobi. People probably know of the fact that IHAB was the site where some key technological innovations were created, including like the open source mapping system that is used today in disaster management. And so here in the slide, I have some quotes. So UN General Secretary Ban Ki-moon visited this incubator and quote unquote saw the future of Africa. Meta's founder, Mark Zuckerberg, made also a surprise visit here in 2016, quote unquote, to learn about mobile money, while he was publicizing his very controversial internet.org campaign that would bring free internet to the poor of the world through Facebook. And also Melinda Gates at some point was here arguing, quote, that the most innovative ideas in the world could come from places like Kenya, unquote. So this is the second story that I opened the book with, right? These anecdotes speak to the fact that today Nairobi is known as one of the African capitals of innovation. And attesting to this, there was a couple of weeks ago, actually a couple of days ago, reporting that, again, this year, actually last year, Nairobi was the city in Africa, and Kenya was the country in Africa that received the largest amount of venture capital investment in the local tech ecosystem, which, it's interesting because Kenya is not the biggest country in Africa. It's not the wealthiest country in Africa, but it has the most promising, according to VC, ecosystem. So the question that I ask is, okay, we have these two stories, the Look East and the Silicon Savannah. What have they got to do with each other? Aside from the fact that kind of like they happen at the same time, there's a spatial proximity also because some of these incubators are located in the same area that became known as Nairobi's Chinatown. And so this was the empirical question. This is the empirical question at the heart of the book, right? What have the story of China's rise and the story of the Silicon Savannah got to do with each other? And there is a banal answer to this story, and to this question, which is, well, of course, in Kenya, you didn't just have the construction and engineering companies, you also had China's digital players, right? China's so-called digital champions. You had companies like Huawei, ZTE, China Mobile, that probably had been in Kenya. Actually, not probably, but surely had been in Kenya even longer than the construction giants like CRBC. And so to give you an example, I mentioned mobile money, right? Mobile money is something that Kenyans are incredibly proud of because it was something that was created in Kenya. It is owned by Safaricom. Safaricom is a company that is listed on the Nairobi Stock Exchange, even though partly owned by Vodafone. And yet the digital infrastructure, the stack upon which mobile money works was something that was designed and built by Huawei. But this for me is kind of like a banal answer. And the actual answer for me is that at a deeper level, the story of the Silicon Savannah, or the story of the Silicon Savannah's Beijing connection, as one of my interlocutors called it, has been a terrain of promises that are forging new trajectories of Techno-Capital itself. So, and this is where the irony lies, that the Silicon Savannah, the tech scene in Nairobi, borrows a nickname from Silicon Valley, the kind of like the putative birthplace of everything digital. But it would be impossible to understand the Silicon Savannah current place in the global economy of technology without understanding and tracing the circulations of and the integration of China's digital industry in the African continent. And so this is the main argument of my book, that the Silicon Savannah is also the experimental site of a technological transition that, in spite of Silicon Valley's dominance in the global imagination of the digital economy, also begins at the encounter of an African city with Chinese ideas, experts, entrepreneurs, startups, business models, platforms, and on and on. And against this backdrop that we live in, or that we see all around us, right? This kind of like geopolitical anxiety about a second Cold War, or a tech Cold War, as the New York Times called it a year back. Silicon Elsewhere, so my book, I guess, offers a different perspective, a different story. And it does so. I won't bore you too much with the kind of intellectual and more conceptual background of the book, but it's that was my starting point, right? So what if we take a different vantage point, instead of in a way putting to test the kind of geopolitical anxieties and looking at the empirical story of how a city like Nairobi, which is booming, which is, as I said, this kind of like known as a capital of innovation. It is cosmopolitan, it is fast changing, but also incredibly complex and incredibly contradictory. How has the city become the experimental site of the encounter between the kind of, China's digital ambitions, whatever we want to call them, and the aspirations of the developmental aspirations of an African nation seeking to emancipate technologically and economically? Can Nairobi be the foil, right, or the screen through which we read these technological shifts? And of course, one of my inspirations was C.K. Lee's work. C.K. Lee is a scholar of that coined the idea of global China in the book The Spectre of Global China. And her argument is fundamentally that that we shouldn't take China as a monolith. China is a bundle of power, is a set of relations, and only by understanding different varieties of capital, so different forms of capital, we can fully make sense of the regimes of labor, the regimes of management, the regimes of accumulation that are beholden to this global power. There's a nice line where she explains that global China is a way of saying, right? It's a way of saying China that, instead of taking for granted everything, the Chineseness, I guess, of everything that happens at the behest of China, looks for these variety, right? Looks for this palimpsest of actors, relations, and rationalities. And my proposition is maybe less ambitious, but also inspired by this work. Well, what I'm not necessarily looking at varieties of capital. I ask the question: Can I say the same about varieties of techno-capital? Like, so I'm asking a question about the techno part of that story. And these are ultimately problems that philosophically have been explored in many different ways. And I don't want to get into it too much, but one of the inspirations came from a philosopher of techniques whose work I really like, Yujie, who has written about this idea of technological difference and the importance fundamentally to abandon the idea that we can find something anthropologically universal about technology when technology exists across different registers that can be cosmological, that can be ethical, that can be, but also, and this is the work that I do in the book, also very pragmatic, right? It may be responding to very different circumstances, and therefore the ultimate, the ultimate object of the techno part of Techno-Capital is not necessarily the same. And in a way, this kind of thinking, the importance of technological diversity or techno-diversity, also speaks to the other STS scholars who have worked with this with ideas of technology. And in particular, I was inspired by Clapperton Mavunga, who's a historian of technology, who has made this very interesting point about the fact that when people write about African innovation, when people write about African technology, whatever they are, they tend to focus on adaptation and tinkering and on kind of like informal make do and survival, in a way belying that the notion that made in Africa is a minor version of made elsewhere, right? That there is no real innovation happening in Africa, there is only tinkering. So in my project, I was like, forget tinkering. I'm actually interested in Techno-Capital. I'm interested in innovation. I'm interested in the cutting edge of this encounter between the Silicon Savannah and digital global China. So the book overall, also in dovetailing with that ambition of not assuming China as a monolith, I take different entry points. And while I do not talk so much about the presence of kind of state companies and state projects, the book does start with an historical sketch of how fundamentally Kenya and China found one another in the digital economy, right? And then there's a chapter that traces, especially through parliamentary records in Kenya, how the digital economy came to be such an important policy goal of the Kenyan government, and how fundamentally that moment coincided with the expansion of China's own digital industry. Chapter 2 is about mobile phones and mobile brands that were specifically designed for African consumer markets. I know there is a book just came out that is entirely dedicated on Trenchant. This is the brand that I mostly worked on. And it is a brand that really started by making phones for African markets, even though it is a Chinese company. Chapter 3, I'll talk about in a moment because it's one of the stories that I want to share with you. Chapter 4 is about technical standards. So another kind of area of where there's a lot of geopolitical debate about. And I focus on something that can be incredibly mundane and also incredibly boring, which is financial standards for cross-border payments. But that turned out to be a very interesting entry point. Chapter 5 is about the some of the work that is necessary to make the Silicon Savannah readable as a project of Techno-Capital. And I know that I may have made some Marxists angry when using the word, the word labor in that particular context. But it was interesting. It's kind of like in labor in relation to risk and how risk is tamed and managed and leveraged, not just through personal entrepreneurialism, which is usually how the startup culture is investigated, but through more kind of like molecular and collective forms of work that deal with risk. Chapter 6 is about I guess it's the methodological chapter, but it's more kind of like a set of sketches that trace the kind of moral horizon of what I ended up investigating, which is techno-optimism, and what it means to do an ethnography of techno-optimism also as an outsider of both Kenya and digital China. And in the conclusion, it is pretty much about this idea of thinking with the elsewhere and what does it do in terms of breathing life into the project of thinking also of the otherwise as a normative project, right? Recognizing that the world we have is not necessarily the best we could. So to put it mildly, sorry. Then I said I wanted, so this, I guess in the last 5 to 10 minutes, I want to take you through one of the stories that I explore in the book. one of the stories that I tell in chapter 3, where I engage a particular type of algorithmic rationality that has to do with fixing and bridging the gap between things like ride-hailing or quick commerce or e-commerce, right? So this, or even more sophisticated platform business models, and the vibrant informal economies of Nairobi, of the city. So the idea of algorithmic suturing is the conceptual anchor of the chapter, and I worked on this notion with my colleagues Liza Chiroli and Jack Odeo, who, this is a shared concept in a way. What we wanted to capture, drawing on the works of other scholars like Malik Simon and Philippe Dubuc, was really that, was really the kind of improvement or optimization or digital augmentation of urban systems that are fragmented or broken or cumbersome for whatever reason, and are then enrolled into platform business models. Now, these business models come from everywhere. It's not just the story of China, but there's something about the specificity of the Chinese experience in the digital economy, whether it is Alibaba or Pinduoduo or Weixin, that provides a blueprint, a particular type of algorithmic blueprint for these experiments with what we call algorithmic suturing. And this is, the chapter is about different businesses, from internet service providers to e-commerce. And I want to talk about e-commerce because e-commerce, it's well known that e-commerce as the example of Pinduoduo or Temu or Alibaba attest, is one of the domains where China is also recognized globally as this kind of like major global powerhouse, rivaling, the other techno powers like Amazon or whatnot. And it is also, e-commerce is also a site of where a lot of innovation has happened in mainland China in terms of production, sourcing, distribution of commodities and fast-moving consumer goods. And there's an incredible work that I've read and used in my book to actually understand what my interlocutors were referring to. And of course, having Julie here is amazing. But while this story of e-commerce in China is, well known, in Kenya, e-commerce is just moving its first steps in a way. There are several options for middle-class consumers, but the lower middle classes, so people who have some disposable income to access online goods, are left out, right? Mass e-commerce is not there yet. And there are several explanations to this. One is that purchase capacity is limited. But then you have, made in China affordable goods that are increasingly available, right? And so the question of price, the problem of price, is kind of addressed by that. What remains to be solved is really, and what I'm trying to represent with these photos, is the last mile problem. The challenge of distribution in a city like Nairobi, where getting commodities to the peripheral outskirts of the city requires, a very nimble, very flexible platform solution. And this kind of agility is necessary not just physically, not just logistically, right? Not just in the organization of the delivery, but also physically, because roads may not be finished. They're under-maintained, so that, it's really hard for a car to navigate these roads. Imagine for a delivery van. And then there's a problem of addressability. So most of these tenement buildings that crop up very, very quickly, expanding the margins of the city, often don't have, for example, house names, right? So it's really hard to build an e-commerce solution for such consumers who are lower middle class consumers. These are not the poorest dwellers of Nairobi, for context. So it is for this reason, actually, that motorcycle taxis, which are called bodabodas in Nairobi, are a crucial mode of transport in the city. They're a crucial mode of transport for pillion, so for taking people around, but also for moving goods and parcels, small goods, not necessarily small goods. I've seen refrigerators and washing machines being carried on a motorcycle taxis, on a motorcycle taxi. So they are a vital lifeline of the city. They fill the gaps where where other logistics or mobility options are not possible. They're too or they're too expensive. They're too inflexible for reaching the last mile. And the Silicon Savannah overall, so the entire tech ecosystem of Nairobi, has been kind of working on the promise of on possibility of these motorcycle taxis, doing everything from e-hailing. So you have players like Uber and Bolt who have a motorcycle taxi option. You have food deliveries. But that's where where my work comes in. Many of these players are actually in the B2B value chain of e-commerce. That means that they connect e-commerce providers with their final customer, right? So they provide the delivery service, the in-between, right? And this is the niche of the e-commerce Bora Bora interface that is dominated by Chinese companies, which are adapting, importing, tweaking platform business models from mainland China with the specific intent of creating last mile solutions for Nairobi's lower middle classes. And one of the examples that I talk about in the chapter is this kind of fledgling e-commerce specialized delivery company called Dasher, which is located in the southern end of the city, so where the logistical hub is. 2 warehouses, quite massive scale facilities for a business that is not there yet, right? And they had a very sophisticated business model, which leveraged a vast network of motorcycle riders throughout Kenya, operating though exclusively in the B2B market, right? The company was funded by a group of Chinese expats, but then the company functioned as a startup subsidiary of a larger conglomerate that had received seed investment from a major express delivery company in China. So it kind of worked also for the main comp, so from this investor, as a way of diversifying their investment portfolio. So I visited their warehouses and their distribution center. I met their logistic manager and some other people in the company. So he explained to me the whole model that they had envisioned. The sorting facility, the distribution center, and then the role that motorcycle taxis would play, fundamentally like filling the gap, right? Suturing in an algorithmic way, the kind of the impossibility of realizing, right, the last mile in a city like Nairobi. And their business model value proposition, right, was explicitly to optimize deliveries for lower income consumers that had been left out by other e-commerce options. And in fact, their first e-commerce clients were indeed established Chinese platforms like AliExpress. And what I was told was that the corporate histories of something like Alibaba also provided a model to be emulated in their capacity to build affordable distribution solutions for lower tier cities in China. So this story speaks to the strategic foresight, in a way, of these type of digital companies. And what I found interesting, and it's also captured in the words that I put on the slide, the manager of the distribution center explained to me that they wanted to be Africa's #1 last mile service provider. He acknowledged that this mission was somewhat aspirational because e-commerce is not there yet, really, at scale. But he also emphasizes their commitment to this long game, right? Believing that e-commerce would eventually flourish as it had done in China. So why did we come here, he said. He asked me rhetorically, right? At this phase, we're building a network. We've connected every country, trained our team, taught them how to be ready. We are waiting like a crouching tiger. So these platforms, in a way, performatively stage the future of African cities as mirroring China's own past development in the platform economy, in the e-commerce economy. And as a kind of arbitrageur, it's a kind of like financial speculator who takes advantage of this kind of like temporal mismatches. The manager who was talking to me expected an e-commerce boom in Africa. It even invested in a number of things like smart cabinets to kind of like even make their logistics system even more capillary. And yet the system was operating at a loss because they weren't handling enough parcels to be sustainable. Yet a future to be capitalized beckoned. No country can escape e-commerce, he told me. I don't know who will be the last winner. In America, it's Amazon. In China, it's Alibaba. And in different countries, they have their own. I don't know who will be the winner in Africa, but whoever it is, they'll need us. And this was the long game, right? Dasher had played with the sophisticated business models of specialized deliveries companies in China, adapted it to the Kenyan context with the addition of the motorcycle riders, and was now waiting in the wings. So this is one of the stories that I tell in chapter 3, which is all about the multiplication and replication of these platform business models in the context of the urban complexity of Nairobi. And in the end, I reflect on some of the contradictions of these promises of technological improvement. And I want to, just to conclude, I want to read some lines from the chapter. Beyond the inventiveness of these businesses, platform experiments modeled upon the mass consumer market reach of Chinese mega apps are not without shadows. In Nairobi, these experiments copy, rely on, sometimes bypass, and sometimes enroll existing informal economies that already act as sutures to the spatial and social fragmentation of the city. Such economies are by nature of their existence in gray legal areas, already precarious, expendable, just as much as the livelihoods that they sustain. Bora Bora riders, so the motorcycle riders, for example, live at the edge of survivability in a city that is rarely kind to them. Digital platforms may not make their lives worse off. In fact, they often do not, but they do seek to tap into this pool of workers whose labor is made cheap precisely by their structural precariousness to produce profit and convenience for others through the optimization of last mile connectivity or the mirage of affordable online shopping. But while it is easy to recognize how these datafied processes, tentative as they may be, enroll what Nefertiti are called the already existing vital platforms of technosocial reproductivity, the economic systems like that of the Bora Bora already, without digital augmentation, provide respite from both the purposeful and arbitrary precarity of life in a fractured post-colonial city. And yet, be it an e-commerce business or logistic operations, the combined efforts of these and other platforms are also experiments in the pluralization of these concerns. Of the concerns which shape the making of technicity and techno-capital in Nairobi. So challenging simplistic visions of neocolonial domination and leapfrogging, the speculative experiments of the chapter that I talked about foreground the place of Nairobi's urban economies in a multipolar, diverse world of techno-capital, where digital global China acts as a source of human and literal capital, but also as a model of diversification. So to conclude, I guess my hope with this book is to show that the Silicon Savannah is not a periphery of Techno-Capital, yearning to catch up with a technological present that the Silicon Valley has already left behind, or just a passive landing spot for China's geopolitical ambitions. What may seem marginal contact zones are in fact the sites of some of the most advanced forms of speculation and experimentation of technological change. Not just the frontiers of innovation from elsewhere, but an elsewhere itself of technicity and reinvention. A geography from which new techno-economic forms originate and emanate, or so they might. And so, thank you. That's it. And the book is available online as an open access.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Congrats. And I like to say to the 25 people watching us, feel free to send your questions because after our comments, we'll have a round of Q&A. And now I'd like to pass the ball to Julie Chen. Julie Chen is Associate Professor here at University of Toronto. Hello, Julie. If you
Hi,
to ask your question.
thank you for having me, and Andrea, congratulations on this fascinating book. Um, I actually don't know how to do a proper discussion for a book talk, so I'm just going to share some of my reading experience. I wanted to say that two most striking elements of my reading experience. But I wanted to say to all who appear in this live streaming and who maybe later watch the video, I wanted to say this on record. You need to read the book from the beginning to the end. It's just basically a very captivating reading experience with all kinds of insights. So the two most striking elements when I read the book, the first is I have several, I would call it uncanny encounter of familiarity, because I know you're focusing on the familiarity of the Beijing connection that you're using from one of your interlocutor. Like for instance, those encounters of this familiarity for me was like, oh yeah, of course they will see Kai Fu Lee as some inspirational figure to the same degree as Jack Ma. Of course they see some inspirations from the Chinese domestic platform giants in terms of their business models, practices, like for instance the delivery networks, and some which I've noticed that you didn't put a name to it, but I sort of like recognize it immediately. Like for instance, the chapter that you shared on the last mile logistics, they are actually promoting and educating the local team. An analogy of that in the Chinese context, to a large degree, the success of ride-hailing platforms like Didi was to be credited to is the so-called underground food booths that they are doing what they call underground promotion. In the Chinese term, it's called 地推, meaning that they have to educate the users, they have to help them install the apps and this and that. So I just found all of these are so fascinating, especially in the ways that you put human faces to the varieties of techno-capitals that you trace throughout the book. But at the same time, I also found some places that there are the doublespeak of those entrepreneurs, in the sense that, for instance, I think you described this also in the logistic chapter, that they actually value marginal gains in a sense of working against the so-called growth before profit model of the Silicon Valley platform economy. But at that moment, I was like, well, the tech giant platforms within China actually are following the growth before profit. So there are some kind of like, okay, they are actually pursuing the non-Chinese aspect of the Beijing connections. So this is my first striking reading experience. I was like, because you are connecting the dots that I have heard anecdotally from elsewhere. Like for instance, I've heard that the food delivery platform Meituan actually expanding its delivery networks in Middle East by recruiting migrant workers as subcontracted workers, which actually is a copying model of what has been proven successful within China. So again, those are like anecdotes that I've heard, but through all the examples, evidence that you presented in the book, all of those are actually really make sense. The similarity as well as the variations or the local adaptations. And the second really striking moment I've read on the book was the chapter 6, which I think, correct me if I read this in the wrong way, which I think is a unconventional conclusion chapter and a non-appendix methodological reflection, which for me is so beautifully written and with profound insights about how to do ethnography, about the digital world in general. And in some places, it's very, deeply personal. Without giving it too much, I guess this is really a spoiler alert. you are describing your book project as a gamble bet, and well, inspired or maybe partially influenced by your interlocutor, that you actually see it as a, like, quote unquote book project as a startup. So I found it's a very fascinating way of revealing yourself, your research ethnographic journey, and connecting that to the narratives and the argument that you wanted to deliver in the book. So, okay, I think I've said enough about the inspirations that I've taken from the book. I have two broad questions, which related to these two comments that I've just made. The first one is about the way that you craft your chapter six. I'm just wondering if you wanted to share a little bit more about the backstory, your rationale, how you come to this point to write such a concluding chapter, which I think is a very strong concluding chapter. And then the second aspect, the second question that I have is about the so-called doublespeak of the human face or human figure of those technical capital that you narrate in the book, because I know you're focusing on optimism. They always showed excitement, hopeful opportunities that they see in Nairobi, but at some places, like for instance in the fintech, the story of Chen, who actually encountered some social media smear of criminalizing her and her husband. But I'm also wondering, in the field of entrepreneurship, the optimism, hopefulness is always accompanied by like risk anxiety, the so-called dark feelings, the negative feelings. I see you reviewed how you handle your own anxieties in chapter 6, but I'm just wondering whether you wanted to say a little bit more about how you are handling their coping mechanisms of those like non-optimistic feelings and affects. Oh, thank you.
Thank you for the very, very thoughtful question, and for enjoying chapter 6, which is a bit of my gamble, I guess.
Yeah, feel free to answer this question, and I can ask my question later.
Okay, so how did chapter 6 come about? I guess from two different places. One was that one was an intellectual inspiration, and one was a personal desire. The intellectual inspiration came actually from C.K. Lee's book, The Spectre of Global China. She has a chapter at the end, which is not an annex, I think. It's a proper chapter where she retells the story of what it meant for her to decide to do this work and research, and what it meant personally on a very personal level to have encounters that shaped her thinking around this topic. So I had this. When I started writing, I always thought I wanna do something like that, because it's. And then the more I wrote, the more I realized that, and that I was plunged into a situation where, as I write, it was really difficult to navigate that line between the critical distance that is required of us as scholars, as also like normatively, if we believe in a project of a better world or better technology, and the critical proximity that you inevitably develop with your interlocutors or your informants. So I thought, how do you do that? There needs to be a lot of methodological care, also in recognizing my own position, my own privilege, in the kind of incredible access that I was granted, in the incredible permissiveness that I was given to enter these rooms and these spaces, and on and on. So for me, it was then that became, okay, how do I deal with the imposter syndrome of all of this? I need to verbalize it in a way, and I wanted to do it on a personal level. And I'm glad you enjoyed it. I really appreciate your words on this. It came about from these two things, right? An intellectual inspiration and a need to verbalize this, the modes of ethnography that developed out of my desire to have methodological care, right? Not just methodological soundness or methodological rigor, but also care. The double speak, it is a very interesting point. the doublespeak is probably, I mean, I wouldn't bet on everything I wrote. I wouldn't necessarily believe 100% of the stories that I was told, right? It's always the, I have a long experience of researching startups and digital and entrepreneurs, right? And often, they wait on their deals. It's a whole performance. But to answer your question, how do you deal with the double speak? For me, you can have two, modes of action or modes of interaction. One is about kind of like dispelling, right? It's the skeptical thinking, and we all need a degree of skeptical thinking. But the other one is the more pragmatist. The pragmatist one is, I don't need to understand whether these are truths, whether these tales hold water as truths, but I'm actually interested in the kind of works that they do in the world. So there's optimism, and optimism is in the face of failure, constant anxiety, being incredibly precarious, because even if you're privileged, you're risking everything when you're doing a startup or whatever. And so technological optimism acts in the world in the face of all of that. So rather than probing whether or not some of these claims are true, I wanted to see, and I guess my writing tries to trace how they work in the world, what kind of work they do in the world.
Great,
Thank you.
thank you. I One of the things that I mostly enjoyed in the book is the way you don't offer easy solutions, or like how you are addressing like Western theories, especially like around peripheries and center peripheries, or the colonialism debate, and the informal and formal, which is like probably for us, for Julie, for you, for me, is something that is really important, central, and for us a little bit like natural. But for like most scholarship, those things are not like they don't frame uh, these issues in the same way we do. So it's really for me it was really important. And the way you also frame, you say that Marxists probably don't like the way you frame labor. I really enjoyed as well, because I have two questions as well. But my first question is also related to methods. I really enjoyed the sixth chapter, and how we like you start the book talking about the ethnography of techno optimism. You turn back in plural as an ethnographies of techno optimism. And my question is about queerness, and the queer networks. I would love that you elaborate more how um, about it, and how it's present. And for me, methods in writing really walk together during the book. The way you write as like writing as method, and in this sixth chapter, it talks with me when you disclose the guy saying, "Will you be criticizing me in your book?" And because like resonating the way probably like Julie and I also do our research, and now we are in the phase we are writing our own books and reflecting in all these issues. And yeah, I'm curious to hear more about the way queerness played a role there. And my second question was about if you can elaborate more, not only your critique to data colonialism, but like I like your way you framed technological diversity, and the Yujie concept of technological diversity right now is so popular in Brazil, and it's so like resonate in Brazil. And the way you frame, for me, was really important to avoid a kind of technological fetishism, or what you call as a kind of Orientalism as well. So for me, it was really meaningful. So probably, yeah, when like acknowledge the limits of data colonialism and something, or technological colonialism. Um, the way you operate with tech otherwise for me is really important. I'm really enjoying the use of this term, and I will connect my question with a question. Lin Zhang from University of New Hampshire. Lin is here with us, and she asked. And she said, "Thank you for your presentations. Look forward to reading your book from cover to back." And she say, "I'm curious how you think of the tension between arguments about digital platforms as a continuation of Western colonialism and the idea of platforms as developmental projects in your context." Yeah. Thank you, Lynn.
So the question is developmental projects versus Western colonialism.
It's here on the screen.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Rafael, also for reading. It's the best gift ever that one can receive once they. So I look forward also to reading the works of you two guys. On queerness, it's something that that I've been thinking about, and so I was like, I should out myself in a way in the book, more than myself, out my one of the things that I've been thinking about in my research practice, also with my colleague Liza, we wrote a short reflection on this, and we're kind of thinking. I'll give you the backstory. We were asked to, there was a journal that was doing a piece on queer studies in Africa, and they asked us to write for obvious reasons. And we're like, we don't work on queer stuff, so what do we write about? And so we thought, but then we started thinking, and we're like, well, if we think about our research, or we think about the, being bodies, being humans in the world, a lot of the passion and a lot of the the putting ourselves out there had been mediated by what we called kind of like queer infrastructure, which were just basically networks of friends and connections, and that then kind of like blossom and snowball and become larger, and then you can actually land in Nairobi, and all of a sudden you already have a small network. And I had never been to the city before this work, but I landed and I already had this small kind of like safety net, and it was built on that. And so, what did it mean for us to reflect on the fact that it was a queer infrastructure, which wasn't so much about our sexual orientation, but it was more about kind of like how we live in the world and the kind of things we recognize and we see, and the way we see them. And the things we start with, right, which can be people and can be the person we're close by, as the starting points. But then it meant, and this allows me to return to the point that I was making in response to Julie's question, to that idea of care as a way of bridging an impossible relation between critical distance and critical proximity, whereby through queerness, right, we came to see that our work actually always straddles the strange, relations between, the friendship and the research, the collegiality and the business network, and always being a little bit more than just an academic in the field. So I don't know whether it is something that is specific to queerness, but I wanted to say that my experience of this was specific through my own being a queer man. And that's what I tried to articulate in chapter 6. I don't know if it's satisfactory, but yeah, I like to say it that way. On data colonialism and techno-diversity, I didn't know that Yujie was popular in Brazil. It's actually really interesting. I think there's something very generative about thinking through it, even through the complexity of his own writing and of his writing, and so it's very interesting, and especially as an alternative to the kind of like the one size fits all story of data colonialism, which for me doesn't. The fact that I'm saying I want to muddle that story is not because I don't believe that there are not instances of colonial relations, reproduced colonial relations in data, in digital economies. Of course there are. the problem with the concept for me stems from, I guess, three angles. One that is a bit kind of like my own being an empiricist. Sure, you have data colonialism. Does it stand the test of empirical scrutiny? Can you actually call everything that's happened as within or the framing of coloniality? And I don't think so. I don't think the stories that I tell are just about that. So it is an empirical problem. It is a conceptual problem because there's a little bit of techno-determinism in it, because you assume that if you inject a colonial rationality, what you have as the outcome is a colonial technology, which I don't think that, I reject techno-determinism as a conceptual, as an epistemic mode of thinking. And then there's the political, the data colonialism, the colonialities, becomes, the use of these words that are now used, for example, against China, is tricky. It's tricky because of the geopolitical moment in which we live. So I don't want to use those terms, also for the reason of not playing into certain narratives that for me are problematic. Lynn, I loved your book, Lynn. I think when you read, you see how much of an inspiration you were for me to learn about, for example, e-commerce and in China, and reinvention, and some of the things that I write about as well. In part, I think my answer on data colonialism speaks to the problem of, when it comes to this Western colonialism versus the developmental project. In another sense, though, I do think that in the stories that I tell, it is fundamentally crucial that developmental ambition, both of the, in your work, you show how it is important in the development of the digital economy in China, how it still influences, it's still kind of like so much structuring, right? Some of the ambitions and some of the modes of existence of technology and of, policy in China, and on and on. There is an equivalent, I think, in the Kenyan story, where without the same impressive kind of capacity of the Chinese state, of the Chinese government, Kenya too had embraced, right, the promise of technological emancipation, has embraced the promise of technological emancipation, with all the contradictions, similar contradictions, different contradictions. But without that embrace, without that developmental ambitions, you wouldn't have things like mobile money. You wouldn't have the Silicon Savannah story. And I don't think it's a story of just a Western colonialism, honestly. Even if Vodafone is there.
Excellent. If people from the audience, you have more questions. Julie, do you have more questions?
For me?
Yeah.
Well, to build on Lynn's questions about framing digital platforms as a developmental project, I recorded, which reminds me of another book that I read on e-commerce in China. It's Li Zhiliu's book, From Click to Farm. Well, she had this counterintuitive argument, about, or conclusion about the impact of e-commerce platforms on rural areas, which is substantiated by her empirical evidence, which is as framing rural areas for production, there's no substantial push. But to reframe or reconnect the rural areas for consumption, e-commerce actually make a huge, significantly push for that. So I guess it's more like a comment in the sense of how to see digital platforms, and maybe next stage, the techno optimism is no longer about the platforms as we know it, with AI and all other techno promises. Is how to really define and curate or narrate the development project, right? In that sense. I don't think that's a question, but it's just something that I think of.
And I absolutely agree with you. And and I also was struck by that conclusion in from Click to Boom around that shift to consumption, which resonates also with what's happening in Kenya, where you have GDP growth, you have some kind of like, but there's no real kind of like industrialization shift happening in any sense, right? And yet there is this mirage, there is this long, this ambition of catching up or mimicking China's own developmental trajectory without the production, right? Without that component. That's why I say, look, I don't like my goal was not to dispel or prove people wrong or say, well, this story doesn't make any sense, but to say, okay, and yet it's still a very powerful narrative. It's still a very powerful tale. It is something that performs the world in which the people in my book live.
Yeah, in the e-commerce part, both in your book, Andrea, and in the Lin Zhang's book, is had a lot of like resonance in Brazil. I can see some of the things in similar ways, and and now with my new project about the women AI consultants, with like and similar struggles between like the techno optimism and this more like startup aspirations or something. Great. Lynn said that Julie made a good point. Excellent. So if you want to read Silicon Elsewhere, go to UC Press website. It's available paperback and also open access if you want to read. And feel free to reach out, Andrea, to share your comments. Next week, we'll be back with a book talk with Robert Dorschel about his new book on the social codes of tech workers, published by MIT Press in the collection of labor and technology. Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, Julie. Have a good day.
Thank you both.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, Rafael.
You're the best comrade. You're the best comrades I could ask for. Thank you so much.
All right.
Okay.